Good day, this is Dimitri Lascaris coming to you from Kalamata, Greece for Reason to Resist on September 30th, 2025. Yesterday, the war criminals Donald Trump and Benjamin Netanyahu held yet another press conference in Washington to announce a new 20-point peace plan. With his typical outlandish hyperbole, Trump claimed that he and his fellow war criminal had found a way to bring eternal peace to the Middle East. Have a listen.
The whole deal, everything getting solved. It's called peace in the Middle East. So today is a historic day for peace, and Prime Minister Netanyahu and I have just concluded an important meeting on many vital issues, including Iran, trade, the expansion of the Abraham Accords, and most importantly, we discussed how to end the war in Gaza, but it's just a part of the bigger picture, which is peace in the Middle East. And let's call it eternal peace in the Middle East.
You heard it, folks. Eternal peace in the Middle East. Interestingly, only 1 week ago, Tom Barak, the U.S. ambassador to Turkey and Syria, and a longtime friend and fundraiser for the Donald, gave an interview in which he too talked about peace. Here's what Barak had to say 7 days ago.
I was hoping you weren't going to ask that because I don't know. I don't think anybody knows. Look, the end game, when we say peace, it's an illusion. There's never been peace. There will probably never be peace because everybody's fighting for legitimacy. So people say, well, they're fighting over borders and boundaries. It's not what they're fighting over. A border or boundary is the currency of a negotiation. The end result is somebody wants dominance, which means somebody has to submit. In that part of the world, submit, there's no Arabic word for submit. They can't wrap their head around submit.
So somehow, within the space of about 7 days, the Trump regime went from saying that there will never be peace in the Middle East to saying that the US and Israel have brought eternal peace to the Middle East. That's quite impressive. In this report, we'll break down key excerpts from yesterday's nauseating press conference in Washington, and then I'll explain my assessment of what is really going on here. To cut to the chase, what is really going on here is that this so-called peace deal was designed to be rejected by Palestinians. And why, you may well ask, would Trump and Netanyahu concoct some peace plan that is designed to be rejected? Because Israel is rapidly becoming, and might already be, the most hated state on God's green earth, and Trump and Netanyahu desperately want to change the narrative. They want to convince you that the Palestinians are to blame for their own destruction, and that by rejecting this magnanimous, brilliant, and best ever in the history of humanity peace deal, the Palestinians have given the Israelis no choice but to mass murder their children. That is what is really going on here. Now, let's take a closer look at the basic elements of this so-called peace deal. Let's start with the explanation that the Donald offered as to the key terms.
Committed, and in writing in many cases, but I actually would take their word for it. The people I mentioned, I'd take their word for it. To demilitarize Gaza, and that's quickly. Decommission the military capabilities of Hamas and all other terror organizations. Do that immediately. And we're relying on the countries that I named and others to deal with Hamas. And I'm hearing that Hamas wants to get this done too, and that's a good thing. And destroy all terror infrastructure, including the tunnels, weapons, of production facilities. They have a lot of production facilities that would destroy.
As to the suggestion that Hamas is inclined to accept this deal, which the Donald says is what he's hearing. In fact, there have been two statements out of Hamas in the past 24 hours, which would lead a rational human being to believe that they're very unlikely to accept this deal. But I digress. Let's hear now what Netanyahu had to say about the basic terms of the deal.
Leadership, we're taking the next step to win the war and expand the peace. Your plan is consistent with the 5 principles my government set for the end of the war and the day after Hamas. Everybody asks, what is your plan for the day after Hamas? Here's our plan. Passed it in the cabinet. All our hostages, both those who are alive and those who died, all of them will return home immediately. Hamas will be disarmed. Gaza will be demilitarized. Israel will retain security responsibility, including a security perimeter for the foreseeable future. And lastly, Gaza will have a peaceful civilian administration that is run neither by Hamas nor by the Palestinian Authority. If Hamas agrees to your plan, Mr. President, the first step will be a modest withdrawal, followed by the release of all our hostages within 72 hours. The next step will be the establishment of an international body charged with fully disarming Hamas and demilitarizing Gaza. I appreciate your willingness to lead the body, Mr. President. I really appreciate it because you have a lot of things to do, and this is important. And it reflects the confidence that this will give everyone, that things will be followed up on all the commitments made. The fact that you're taking this on, I think, helps a lot to make sure that everything flows in the direction that we want. Now, if this international body succeeds, we will have permanently ended the war. Israel will conduct further withdrawals linked to the extent of disarmament and demilitarization, but will remain in the security perimeter for the foreseeable future.
Now, basically, what emerges from these two explanations of the elements of the deal, the basic elements of the deal, and this is confirmed by this 20-point plan. You can read it. It's widely available. It's almost like something that somebody wrote on the back of a napkin. It's hardly sufficiently detailed to have any realistic prospect of bringing an end to this slaughter. But let's put that aside for a moment. The critical aspects of this are that the Palestinians have to do two things before, I repeat, before Israel performs any of its obligations under the deal. First, Palestinians must disarm. And it's clear from Trump's statement and the text of the deal that they're not only talking about Hamas when they say disarm, because, for example, in Trump's statement that I just showed you, he referred to other terror organizations. And in this context, it's important to recall that the West and the Israelis regard any armed resistance to the occupation, even if that resistance targets only Israeli military personnel, as terrorism. So when Trump says that all terror organizations must disarm, what he means is the total disarmament of Palestinians and the abandonment by the Palestinian people of their right to resist their oppression by means of arms. This is a moral right and a legal right that they have under international law. And again, they demand that the Palestinians abandon that right before Israel performs any of its obligations under the deal and while Israel is carrying out a genocide against them. In a minimally decent and sane world, the party that would be obliged to disarm would be the perpetrator of the genocide and not the victims of it. As I've pointed out, in addition, many times, about 80% of Palestinians oppose the disarmament of the resistance. This was as a result of a poll that was conducted by a reputable polling firm in the occupied territories in May of this year. Therefore, this demand, quite apart from its grotesque unreasonableness, is simply a non-starter for the Palestinians. And for this reason alone, I would be astonished if the resistance groups would accept it. Now, under Trump's deal, the second thing the Palestinians must do before Israel performs any of its obligations under the deal is that they must hand over all Israeli prisoners of war in their custody. And the POWs and the weapons possessed by the resistance are essentially all the leverage that they have in their dealings with the Israelis. Therefore, in demanding the Palestinians give up the POWs and the weapons they possess before Israel performs any of its obligations, in effect, the Americans and the Israelis are telling the Palestinians, you're just going to have to trust us to carry out our obligations under this deal after you've surrendered all of your leverage. Now, what sane human being would trust these lying psychopaths? These are the same people who tried to murder the Hamas negotiating team in Doha only 3 weeks ago, after they lured the Hamas negotiators to Qatar with assurances that a new peace deal would be put forward for their consideration. These are the people who tore up the Gaza ceasefire agreement that was negotiated in January of this year when Trump returned to the White House, and then began starving Palestinians after they tore up the deal. These are the people who have violated the ceasefire agreement with Lebanon on literally thousands of occasions since it was entered into late last year. And these are the people who pretended to be negotiating with Iran when in reality they were secretly preparing to launch a criminal war of aggression on Iran. Here is the painfully obvious truth. The US and Israeli regimes are agreement incapable. Their word is mud. They are the epitome of treachery and perfidy. You can't trust them as far as you can throw them. And no one, my friends, knows this better than Palestinians. Now, within hours of the termination of this press conference, Netanyahu wasted no time in stating unequivocally to an Israeli audience speaking in Hebrew that he has no intention of respecting the basic terms of the deal. Here's what he had to say in response to questioning from an Israeli journalist.
איך אתה מסכם את הביקור?
זה היה ביקור מצוין. גם ההתחלה באו"ם וגם הסיום בוושינגטון. זה הביקור הרביעי שלי בוושינגטון מאז שהנשיא טראמפ נבחר. זה ביקור היסטורי. במקום שהחמאס יבודד אותנו, הפכנו את היוצרות ובודדנו את החמאס. עכשיו כל העולם, גם העולם הערבי והמוסלמי, לוחץ על החמאס לקבל את התנאים שהצבנו יחד עם הנשיא טראמפ, לשרת כל חטופינו, החיים והחללים כאחד, כשצה"ל נשאר ברוב הרצועה. מי היה מאמין לזה? הרי כל הזמן אומרים, אתה חייב לקבל את התנאים של החמאס, להוציא את כולם, צה"ל צריך לצאת החוצה, והחמאס יכול להשתקם, ויכול גם לשקם את הרצועה. לא ולא, זה לא קורה. ההפך, והנשיא טראמפ הוסיף, שאם החמאס יסרב, הוא ייתן כל הגיבוי לישראל להשלים את הפעולה הצבאית וחיסולו. ולכן אני חושב שמכל צעד זה היה ביקור מצוין.
ראש הממשלה, יש שאלה שנשאלת, האם הסכמתם למדינה פלסטינית?
ממש לא. זה גם לא כתוב בהסכם. אבל דבר אחד כן אמרנו, שאנחנו נתנגד בתוקף למדינה פלסטינית. הנשיא טראמפ גם אמר את זה, הוא אמר שהוא מבין את זה, הוא אמר באו"ם גם שזה יהווה את פרס עצום לטרור וסכנה למדינת ישראל, וכמובן שאנחנו לא מסכימים.
תודה רבה, ראש הממשלה.
So you will have seen, if you were able to read the captions, that in regard to the issue of whether the Israeli military would withdraw from all of the Gaza Strip, Netanyahu said, no way, that's not happening, even though that is required by this deal to occur. And in fact, although it doesn't set a specific time frame with hard dates by which that must occur, and that's one of the many flaws in this deal from the Palestinian perspective, it does clearly envision that the IDF will withdraw from the Gaza Strip. He just said, no way, it's not happening. Secondly, although there isn't, and again, this is one of the major flaws in this 20-point plan, there isn't a clear commitment to the creation of a Palestinian state. There's a paragraph in there where they say that maybe one day there will be conditions necessary for the creation of a pathway to a Palestinian state, something like that, okay? But clearly it's written in such a way as to lend legitimacy to the idea that perhaps under certain conditions, a Palestinian state could be envisioned and come into existence one day. And in that interview that Netanyahu just gave, he said, I'm absolutely opposed to any Palestinian state. He didn't say for the time being, he didn't say the conditions aren't right at this time. he stated his unequivocal opposition ever to the existence of a Palestinian state. So already the Israelis are using this 20-point plan like toilet paper. Toilet paper gets more respect than this 20-point plan. So no one should have any doubt about the fact that if the Palestinians surrender their leverage before Israel performs any of its major obligations under this deal, the Israelis will simply ignore those obligations. Therefore, to my mind, it's inconceivable that the Palestinian resistance will accept this deal. And I find it very difficult to believe that the Americans and the Israelis don't understand this. Now, let's assume that the Palestinians lose their minds and decide to trust these monsters by giving up their leverage before Israel has to perform any of its obligations under the deal. And let's suppose that Israel miraculously keeps its word for the first time in the history of the genocidal entity. What would that mean for Palestinians? Well, I'm here to tell you that what that would mean is permanent subjugation. Listen to this.
To ensure the success of this effort, my plan calls for the creation of a new international oversight body, the Board of Peace, we call it, the Board of Peace, sort of a beautiful name, the Board of Peace, which will be headed, not at my request, believe me, I'm very busy, but we have to make sure this works. The leaders of the Arab world and Israel and everybody involved asked me to do this, so it would be headed by a gentleman known as President Donald J. Trump of the United States. That's what I want, is some extra work to do, but it's so important that I'm willing to do it, and we'll do it right, and we're going to put leaders from other countries on, and leaders that are very distinguished leaders, and we'll have a board, and one of the people that wants to be on the board is the UK former Prime Minister, Tony Blair. Good man, very good man.
A good man indeed. He has the blood of hundreds of thousands of innocent Iraqis on his hands. So basically, the Donald is appointing himself, or I should say the leaders of the Arab world appointed him, the chairman of the board that will rule Gaza for an undefined period of time. The man who has enabled and continues to enable Israel's genocide against the Palestinian people at every turn expects Palestinians to accept him as their ruler? Is he joking? And if that isn't bad enough, under this plan, Palestinians would also have to submit to the authority of Tony Blair. Now, it's important to note that the mandate of this Board of Peace is not limited in time. There is no termination date in the 20-point peace plan for the oversight of Gaza by the Board of Peace. The rule of the Board of Peace, therefore, could go on forever. Its mandate will end only when the US and Israel, the genocidal criminals, decide to end it. In other words, under this peace deal, the best case scenario for Palestinians is permanent subjugation. Meanwhile, the worst case scenario is extermination, because Israelis could easily decide, once they have their POWs back and have disarmed Palestinians, that they will murder Palestinians with even greater ferocity. Unless the Palestinians are slaves or suicidal, and I do not believe that they are, they will reject this deal out of hand. Now, in this press conference, it quickly emerged that this is not a peace deal at all. Rather, it's an ultimatum. Here's what Trump said about the possibility that the Palestinian resistance might reject the deal.
Thousands of years, I think you can probably say, if you really look into it, if you study back, if you're a scholar, you would say thousands of years. Israel would have my full backing to finish the job of destroying the threat of Hamas. But I hope that we're going to have a deal for peace. And if Hamas rejects the deal, which is always possible, they're the only one left. Everyone else has accepted it. But I have a feeling that we're going to have a positive answer. But if not, as you know, Bibi, you'd have our full backing to do what you would have to do.
And here's what Netanyahu had to say about the possibility that the Palestinians would reject the deal.
Hamas rejects your plan, Mr. President, or if they supposedly accept it and then basically do everything to counter it, then Israel will finish the job by itself. This can be done the easy way, or it can be done the hard way.
In other words, Palestinians, if you don't capitulate, we'll continue to bomb, burn alive, blow to bits, and starve to death your children. My friends, all of this is a set-up. The Palestinians are being set up to be blamed for their own destruction. The story we are already being told, even within this press conference, is that the wonderful Americans and Israelis are being incredibly generous and reasonable to the Palestinians. And how dare they reject this deal? If they are so extreme and savage and unreasonable as to do that, they have only themselves to blame for their extermination. Just listen to how Trump in this press conference talked about the history of Israel's occupation of Gaza.
Forget how we got here. Hamas was elected by the Palestinian people. Israel withdrew from Gaza thinking they would live in peace. Remember that a long time ago, they withdrew. They said, you take it. This is our contribution to peace. But that didn't work out. That didn't work out. It was the opposite of peace. They pulled away. They let them have it. And I never forgot that because I said, that doesn't sound like a good deal to me. As a real estate person, I mean, they gave up the ocean, right? Ron, they gave up the ocean. They said, who would do this deal? And it still didn't work out. They were very generous, actually.
No, Donald, they weren't generous because that land didn't belong to them to begin with. Basically, he's saying because they gave back to the Palestinians something they stole from them, they were being generous. And by the way, the occupation of Gaza never ended. Even though they took the settlements out of Gaza because the burden of protecting those lunatics, those fanatics, was too great for the Israeli military, not because they were doing any favors to the Palestinians. The occupation never ended, and I know that, and all of you should readily accede to that proposition because last year, the International Court of Justice ruled that Israel continues to occupy and has continued to occupy Gaza, even though it removed the settlements and its soldiers were not permanently stationed on the territory of the Gaza Strip, because Israel controls the airspace of Gaza and controls the boundaries of Gaza and controls everything that goes in or out of Gaza, and occasionally, whenever it feels like it, bombs the bejesus out of Gaza and temporarily inserts its forces into Gaza to conduct some murderous terrorist act. So the occupation never ended, but more importantly, giving back to the Palestinians the Gaza Strip, which the Israelis never actually did, would not be an act of generosity because that was stolen land from the outset, as is, by the way, all of historic Palestine. Now, for this propaganda exercise to have any chance of success, Trump and Netanyahu needed Washington's Muslim and Arab vassals to participate. This allows the Trump and Netanyahu regimes to claim with a straight face, as you just saw in one of the excerpts I showed you, that the whole Arab and Muslim world are behind the deal. And so how in God's name can Palestinians reject it? It would be much harder, believe me, for Trump and Netanyahu to convince Westerners that the deal is fair to Palestinians if Washington's Arab and Muslim vassals rejected it. So the puppets are central to the success of this propaganda exercise, all of which demonstrates just how vile and loathsome these puppets of Washington are. In fact, we got a glimpse in this press conference of the abject servitude of the Arab autocrats to the authority of Washington. In the press conference, Trump and Netanyahu revealed that they had held a three-way call with the Prime Minister of Qatar to kiss and make up after Israel violated Qatar's sovereignty and killed one of its security officials in an attempt to murder the Hamas negotiating team 3 weeks ago. Here's what Netanyahu had to say about that three-way call.
Call today, just to make it clear, I said to the sorry, the Prime Minister of Qatar, Israel was targeting terrorists, wasn't targeting Qatar. And of course, we regretted the loss of the Qatari citizen, wasn't our target.
Well, we already knew that you were targeting Hamas, Netanyahu. That wasn't any great revelation. The only new thing in that excerpt that emerged was that Israel, quote unquote, regrets the murder of a Qatari official. He was a security agent. So that's all it takes to hold Israel accountable in the view of the Qatari emir, the regime in Qatar that accused Israel of state terrorism after this attack 3 weeks ago and vowed fiery retaliation and said that Israel must be held accountable and that it was the most barbaric act committed in the history of barbaric acts. That's it. Netanyahu has to get on the phone and say, hey man, we regret that we murdered one of your citizens. And the fact that he was a Qatari official, them's the breaks. That's all it takes, folks. Yes, these Qataris, I think we can say with a high degree of confidence, do not speak for the Arab and Muslim peoples. And in fact, that is true of all of these house slaves of Washington. They don't represent the Arab and Muslim peoples. The Arab and Muslim peoples are not behind this outlandishly bad so-called peace deal. And in fact, all the evidence suggests that they are hotly opposed to it. The fact of the matter is that the autocrats who are participating in this disgraceful propaganda exercise represent not the Arab and Muslim peoples, but the barbaric ruling elites of the West. Now, you may be interested to know that on this incredibly historic occasion, Trump and Netanyahu refused to take any questions at the end of their press conference. Why? Because when you're engaged in an outrageous propaganda exercise, the last thing you want is questions. Now, finally, I must say, my friends, that this whole thing reeks of desperation, not just in Washington and Tel Aviv, but also in the capitals of Arab and Muslim states that are playing a role in this kabuki theater. The Trump and Netanyahu regimes are desperate because they have been unable, after 2 years of genocide, to defeat Hamas or recover Israeli prisoners of war, and because Israel has become deeply despised among a broad swath of Western electorates. The disgust that Americans in particular feel for Israel is becoming worse by the day. Meanwhile, Israel's army is exhausted and demoralized, its economy is battered, and its society is profoundly divided. The Arab and Muslim vassals are desperate because the overwhelming majority of their citizens are seething with anger at Israel's crimes and at their leaders' failure to take any meaningful action to stop these crimes. That's what this whole exercise ultimately reveals. It reveals desperation. And their desperation means, my friends, that the pressure is working. So please ignore these theatrics, escalate the pressure, and let's bring this horror to an end. This is Dimitri Lascaris coming to you from Kalamata, Greece on September 30th, 2025.